in fact, became the spokes people for the majority of Australia. During a whole period of years, they brought together so many diverse groups, with their structures which promote discussion. Some would say interminable discussion. But you know, by being, they provided a forum for, I think, for millions of Australians, which was absolutely invaluable, because we're still, see, when you look at political parties in Australia, I'm sorry to say, but the political parties in Australia would only account for 5% of the population, you know, in membership. You know, it's not exactly the greatest single forum. And if you look around Australia these days, and you look at the existence of the ethnic groups, if you look at the existence of the state councils, regional councils, and FECA, you know, you've got a wonderful sounding board for millions of Australians, which if they didn't exist, where would you get it?
What about the next step, though, from FECA and the ethnic communities to government? How effective have they really been in influencing? I mean, can you actually point to
Well, I think the difficulty in recent years, from my assessment, has been that that FECA has fought on so many fronts, and again, it's been very difficult without a spearhead body. You see, they're volunteers. The president of FECA is a volunteer. They've got a small secretariat, but it's extremely difficult for the president of FECA, for example, to operate as effectively as he might, given the great base of support. The conferences, the annual FECA conferences, usually come up with, what, 50 or 60 resolutions. There's so many things that need to be done. There's so many things that people want to do. But there's no effective mechanism for them to be followed up, in my opinion. How can it be done? Well, I think that, again, there is a gap in government. Because if you happen to be an Anglo-Australian, you're not going to FECA, you're not going to the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs, so where do you go? I'm not sure. If you're Aboriginal, of course, you go to ASTIC. And if you, of course, are an ethnic, inverted commas, well, then you go to FECA. Now, in the time that I was Minister, well, it was the lot, all in. When I was Commissioner, it was a spearhead organisation, all in. Now, you've got 3 different groups and 3 different roads ahead. And I don't think that's very satisfactory, because it's weakening. It's weakening. You're quite right in asking that question. Where should the nexus be? Well, I think it's got to be in the development of a unit of government. I don't say you invent a new one, but Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs is only a word these days. I mean, the Ethnic Affairs officers do a good job within the limits of the public service designations of duties. But I think that should be taken out and made, if you like, the Department of Multiculturalism. I think if you want to really knit them together, there should be a Minister for Multiculturalism. You might say, oh, well, there is now, but I mean, it's just a title. But I mean, a minister with a department. It doesn't have to be a big department. You can give them 20 people, but give them the authority to do things. And that department takes care of the national entity, the family of the nation, if you like. And then you can knit the 3 together under that heading. He doesn't need a new big you know, resources and all that sort of thing. What you need is a place where, for example, Feka can go, where the others can go, where Aboriginals could go in relation to the nation, not in relation to their own particular needs, but in relation to the nation. So I think there is that gap, and I think it exists today, and I think until we fill it, there'll be this fragmentation.
In terms of influence, though, I know it's difficult, though. A lot of people haven't actually come up with specific examples or areas where the ethnic communities, councils and FECA have actually can say, yes, we've achieved this.
Well, I'll give you one example that I think is good. When I finished my 3 months of experimentation with ethnic radio, it was taken over then by the Department of the Media. Now, the Department of the Media, again, a group of public servants, they kept the original, the original format. In fact, they still have, for radio, the original format. But there have been a lot of attempts to, to change it and to shuffle it away. And of course, when ethnic television came in, well, Fraser, of course, had a SBS. He had a different approach, which is fair enough because he did something. I was going to launch ethnic television in '75, and I had the money earmarked, and I had already stuff in the can to start it off. But I was going to start off on a smaller scale, like ethnic radio, whereas he, of course, had a considerably bigger enterprise, which was very good. I mean, good start. But don't forget, both of them would have been destroyed if it had not been for the absolute support, the absolute, dedication of the ethnic communities councils and FECA to keeping them going as an expression of multicultural Australia, not as an expression of government policy or, of conformist groups. I mean, they fought that battle and they won that battle very well. And I'm very proud of that. And I think there's been, I think the other thing that you must give them great credit for is their part in the Blaney debate. Because don't forget, the Blaney debate unleashed forces which had been dormant. There were people in the coalition parties particularly who thought that he was entirely correct and moved off on that basis. John Howard, for example. So, I mean, that was going to undo 20 years of work. Now, who were the spearheads there? Well, it was the ethnic communities councils and the Federation, of course, all of them. And they did a particularly good job. In Sydney, of course, they did a superb job. They were able to get a Liberal Member of Parliament. Mind you, she was Chinese, I suppose. It would have been difficult to support Blaney's deport all Asians, but nevertheless, it was important for Helen Sham Ho to oppose Howard through the Ethnic Communities Council. And they put in a tremendous amount of effort in stimulating and cooperating with anti-racist groups, which were quite active in Sydney. Well, active everywhere. But they were the only ones. I mean, there were other groups, that support us. For example, Bronwyn Ridgway and the Nurses Federation. I mean, they helped, but they took her to task, burned her car and smashed her windows and attacked her home and all that sort of thing. But, again, although there were supporters out there and church groups and that sort of thing, but the spearhead again was the Ethnic Communities Council. In that debate, that was a tremendously important thing. So their strength has been, when gains have been under attack, I don't think that they've looked, even recently they had the FECA called a conference in Melbourne to deal with all this, the outbreak of criticism caused by the Macedonian dispute. What they said was, one writer said, he said, I'm worried that our foreign policy will be ethnically driven. I thought, well, why shouldn't it be? It's people that... But I knew what he was saying. He didn't mind when it was driven, you know, by the Raj to go to wars on their behalf. You know, we're happy with that. But that's the double standard. But you get that as a result of this fragmentation, I think. I think it's got to be drawn together. I think that's the weakness of the present time. It's got to be drawn together. But in the meantime, I think it's very important that the Federation, very important that the Ethnic Communities Council remain active and keep their eye on the main ball. See, there's so many issues. And of course the divisions, the argument over Macedonia, well, you know, that's a sad argument, but it's something for resolution there. It's not going to be resolved here. As the Minister for Northern Greece said, you've got a wonderful multicultural society, you know, work at that. Leave us to fix our problems with our neighbours. And I agree with that. You can have divisions of opinion, but it's not necessary to, you know, it's not necessary to take the Belfast situation into the Ethnic Communities Council. Somebody could go along and propose a motion that, you know, the British withdraw tomorrow morning, and if they don't, war will then be declared. Well, you'd have some arguments about that. You know what I mean. The world is not for us to solve, but the communities here are concerned. Yeah.
You mentioned that you had money earmarked for SBS television. Or, sorry, multicultural.
Yes, yes.
What did you have in mind?
How was I going to do it?
Who suggested the idea of it all? How did it come up?
Well, I thought that was a natural progression, and I discussed it with Whitlam. And Whitlam said, yes, we've done that, we'll fix that. No, television. So he didn't give me very much money for 3 months experiment in radio. I think it was about 38,000. But I got 94,000 earmarked for 2 stations in Sydney and Melbourne. You wouldn't want to tell the Packers and the Murdochs, but never mind. They would do that at lunch. But how I was going to do it was this way. I was going to have a mobile studio, a mobile unit on an experimental band, and use it in the first instance in defined zones. In other words, go to, well, for example, take Preston, Northbridge, Northcote rather, Preston, Northcote and Reservoir, and do cover the problems of that area and project the local people. Not only the problems, of course, but the good things and the bad things, but the area, you know, schools, everything else. And then go into another area, you know, but stratify them so that you've got, you know, richer areas, poorer areas, middle areas, and different mixes of people. And then at the end of 3 months, do a report on what we'd achieved. Oh,
what was the philosophy behind it?
Same as ethnic radio. Involved, because it was going to be, don't forget, multilingual. It was taking television to the people, just as we took radio to the people. And of course, confer with them all the time as to what they wanted. See, with ethnic radio, I set up a panel of mayors in Sydney and Melbourne to all meet to ask their councils. Well, I wanted them also to watch or to listen and get some feedback there. So the idea was to, you know, to get as much feedback as you could. And I was going to do the same with ethnic television.
Fraser's concept was different.
Oh, entirely different.
It was multicultural Fraser.
Yes, I know. Yeah, what he did was, after 75, the new government, of course, the 94,000 never materialised, and I wasn't going to be given the job anyway. So ethnic television died. But the story is very interesting because there was a man in North Sydney, and if you can find his name for me, I'll be eternally grateful. But there was a man who ran an advertising agency in North Sydney, done some work for the Liberal Party at election times. He had a very highly sophisticated agency in which studios and, you know, production, particularly with, in all sorts of ways. He was a very efficient operator, and he had a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And he contacted me and said that he wanted to launch ethnic commercial television. And he was very keen to enlist my support, and I told him what I was going to do, and I said, of course, you can do it far better. And he had $1 million to invest in it. Made my 94,000 look a bit small. But anyway, he had $1 million. And he asked me to recommend somebody to run his news bureau, because he had in mind using the device where you can press a button and you can get the language of your choice, which you can do. You can do that in some television sets I've seen in Japan and Europe. So he was going to do all that. So I recommended Isabel Lucas, who was the first ethnic affairs reporter, I think, with the Sydney Morning Herald. And I think he contacted her. But the main thing is, I told him that whatever plans he made, he would have to get an experimental license, or he'd have to get a special license anyway. I would have had the experimental license. He could have got a special license probably. But I said, you've got to go and see Tony Staley, who was the Minister for Communication. So he did, and he saw Fraser too. But Fraser, just before the 77 election, but what Fraser did was he took all the ideas and then and put them into another context. So he never got his ethnic television license, but he sparked Fraser to hire Bruce Gingell, who put that together. And it was a good start. It was a good start, excellent start, really. But it's interesting, when you look at his cabinet and the times that he was there, it's very strange to find Malcolm Fraser was the only one with any great feeling for the ethnic Australia, meaning everybody, but in those terms.
Why do you think that was the case?
I think a lot of it had to do with Petra Georgiou, and the fact that Fraser, it was very interesting. I'll tell you a little story which impressed me tremendously. Don't forget, the election was in December. In January of the
76.
Yes. Well, in January of 76, there had been organised in Melbourne a Glendy, which is a Greek celebration, but it had a link up with Greece and Australia, where Karamanlis and Whitlam were to exchange greetings. And it was planned as a really big thing. And we anticipated, I was part of the organising committee, and we anticipated, I think we had hope for about 10,000. Pardon me. Well, whether it was the influence of the election, pardon me, with Greek community stirred up, I don't know. But there was about 70,000 people turned. It's the biggest gathering I've seen in Melbourne, or in Australia for that. And it was really very, very impressive. Anyway, of course, Fraser was the Prime Minister, and I was in charge as the Master of Ceremonies that day. The Victorian Police Commissioner said, well, if anything happens, of course, you're responsible. I said, yes, I'm aware of that, but you tell your fellows not to push anybody. Because in those days, there was a lot of fellows who fought at the Polytechnic in Athens, and they were well used to getting pushed around by Mr. Papadopoulos' boys, and they're quite capable of pushing back. So I said, don't push anybody. Help the mothers with the kids, and just be there. But don't interfere with people. Yeah. Well, anyway, of course, it was done in Greek and English. I did the English, and Katina Kairis, who was a Melbourne broadcaster, was my other half of that day, and she was very good. So I said, well, when Fraser comes, we've got to do something, because we don't want booing and we don't want demonstrations. It's supposed to go to Greece. So I said, we better arrange for when the broadcast starts to Greece, we better make sure that everybody, this huge throng, better make sure that everybody's smiling, because they're smiling for Greece, don't forget. And of course I brought Fraser in the back way, so we had a tent and we had a lunch, and then I brought him in under the stage, at the Maya Music World, sat him in the front with the rest of the cabinet fellows and all the rest of it. And I said, now, when the time comes, we'll tell them that, Greece is on, we're now on Greek television, and everybody's smiling, and everybody's, really big build-up for smiling. And then I said, we'll introduce Fraser. I wasn't going to introduce Fraser because that would be a bit, I thought, well, not proper anyway. So I said, you can introduce him. So, of course, Fraser's sitting down there, and the department had prepared a speech for him, the usual thing, Greek function, restaurants, fish and chips, and the usual inspiring stuff. And it went into about 3 pages. Well, he put it in his pocket, took out an envelope, which the speech was in, and wrote 3 paragraphs. Because I watched him, because I thought, well, I better keep an eye on him. Not that he was going to escape, but anyway, he got up, he was introduced, got up, came up the stairs, because he was sitting down there, up the stairs, for the microphone, for the television, and he only said 3 things. And the first thing he said was, the days of Anglo-Saxon domination are over. And of course, Katina translated, and it was great roars, and they didn't really, I don't think, 75 to 80% of the people wouldn't have known who he was. So he made the speech, and he got a nice little round of applause. Some had recognised him, but before anything could happen, of course, he'd finished, and he was down there, and everything went on very happily. But that was a tremendous influence on him, too, because he'd never seen 70,000 people at any rally. And Petra would have said, well, there you are, I told you, there's a lot of people. And I think and that speech, you see, nobody wrote it for him. See, nobody wrote that speech for him. See, he had this departmental pap, which would have been awful. If he'd have stood there and read that, I mean, it would have been awful. But you see, he in his mind, he had in mind something to say. And he said it very effectively and sat down. So therefore I wasn't really surprised when he, when he decided that he was going to maintain multiculturalism and use it in his particular way.
This may be rather cynical to bring it up now, but it also, in one way, raises the phenomenon of the ethnic vote, myth or reality.
Oh, but I think that's true. No, it's not cynical. I think that's very proper. Of course, the ethnic vote is the vote of the Australian people. And I think it's very silly for people. Jim Jupp talks about the influence of the ethnics in the political party, but he truncates it. He deals with the post-war scene, but the pre-war scene was just as ethnic as the post-war scene. I mean, in the Melbourne branches particularly, well, not only Melbourne, but Sydney and everywhere else, the basis of the inner city branches were the Irish. That was the basis of the inner city branches. And Marrickville, for example, I think I mentioned Fred Daly, Frederick Michael Daly, member for Marrickville. Of course, and the mayor was Frank Aloysius Devine, and the council was the Kennedys and the O'Riordans and all those other people. That was it for 150 years. Now, 90% dispersed, went. And poor old Fred, you talk about branch stacking, well, all his old Irishmen were old-age pensioners in the branches by that time. And then, of course, the new Irish wave came. That was the Greeks, because they were 90% at one time, then they went. Nobody ever reached 90%, but the Greeks reached 60%. And, of course, they were politically alive, and they came into the branches. Now, it wasn't a case of stacking them. They were there. They were politically aware. And Fred Daly, of course, would have committed political suicide by ignoring the largest single group of people in his electorate. And so he said to me the last time he ran in Marrickville, he said, Al, if I was a young man starting my political life again, I would learn Greek first. Of course he would. So, of course there's the Greek vote. Of course there's the Italian vote. Of course there's the Anglo-Saxon vote. Everybody's vote. Everybody's vote. And, of course, it doesn't... I mean, there are patterns of post-war immigrants as there were patterns of pre-war immigrants. The Irish voted Labour because they'd nowhere else to go. The Jews voted Labour because they'd nowhere else to go. The Italians voted Labour because they'd nowhere else to go. And the Greeks voted Labour. Not all, but a lot did, because they'd nowhere else to go. These days, of course, it's a different thing. You see, it's a different thing. The Irish, well, you look at John Fay, my God, the Premier of New South Wales. Irish. Michael Photius, Greek, in the Liberal government. And who is the Speaker? Rozzoli. See, people, things change. Things change. So, but there is, by all means, great blocks of people who have to be acknowledged in the Australian context. But it's not like the United States, where people still live in ghettos. The ghetto system is not in place here, and multiculturalism has been partly responsible for that. See, the Irish have gone out of marriage. Well, there'd be 10%. The Greeks are moving every day. They go to the western suburbs. Young fellas get married. He wants a house, so he goes to Lansdale. Yeah. So the Greek content of Marrick, well, just as an example of a suburb, is moving. Who's coming in? Vietnamese from Cabramatta. Look at Leichhardt. These are Little Italy. Do you know what the Italian content of Leichhardt is? About 15%. They've all gone. They've left the shops. They've left the dance halls, the shops, the clubs, Appia and the rest of it, but there's nobody living there. Chinatown. You go to Chinatown and say, well, all the Chinese are in Chinatown. There's not a residence there. They're all clubs, pubs, restaurants, or, billiard rooms or whatever, but nobody's living there. You say, where are all the Chinese? Well, in Kensington, where the Greeks used to be. Where are they gone? Vaucluse. Anyway. See, but that's the advantage of a multicultural ideology. Because if you force people away from the Statsvolk, well, they're not going to mix. Because the Statsvolk don't want to mix. No, but there is an ethnic vote in those terms. Now, but in primitive terms of when people start out, like the Irish, say, and the Greeks, were two good examples. Well, all right, that's fine. But they will go their own way eventually, like everybody else. After all, it's like the Republican movement. 1890, the Republican movement was dominated by not only English, but English-born. They were the leaders of the Republican movement in the 1890s in Australia. See, because they came from a depressed place, they wanted to, and an oppressed place, and they wanted to build a new country and a new utopia, if you like. So, from my point of view, there is the ethnic vote. You particularly with older people whose allegiances are quite strong. But with younger generations, of course, the vote goes everywhere. But with the older generation, I agree. You won't change the older generation because they've had it in their heart and they won't change. But the younger generation, well, look at John Fay. He's a very good example. An Irish family, Irish working class family, which they're all members of the Labour Party. And he's the Liberal Premier of New South Wales. And you were telling me Spiro Moretus changed his allegiances. Did you tell me that?
On the phone, yes.
Yeah. Well, there you are. You see, and Spiro, for 20 years, 25 years, would have been a very strong Labour supporter. Well, he's got the right to change. So there is an ethnic vote, and it does exist, but it exists across the board. And you can make an appeal to people. But it would be very interesting to see, for example, as a test with the Macedonians from Skopje and surroundings, it would be very interesting to see if, in Victoria particularly, whether they all vote for Kennett. I think by the time that the next Victoria election comes along, I have my doubts. Even though on the one issue, he supported them.
You mentioned the 1890 Republican movement. What do you think the current Republic debate signals for multiculturalism?
Very important for multiculturalism. It's part of multiculturalism. because you can't have a multicultural Australia with a head of state that comes from one ethnicity and one religion, particularly when they're both from a minority group and not resident here. It's absurd. And it's divisive. My objection is that it's colonial and divisive, but particularly divisive.
So do you think, I mean, it's very difficult to tell because Keating hasn't actually laid out a model for an Australian republic, but do you hope that it will continue in the way that it has, and what's your vision? So perhaps a better way of saying this, what would your vision be for an Australian republic?
The most important thing is to have the republic. That's an Australian head of state. You go to a referendum, you ask one question. Do you want an Australian head of state? The President of the Republic of Australia. And that's one. And how do you want him chosen? That's about all. Give him 2 or 3 options. That's all. Or her. I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, no, you're quite right. You're quite right, actually. After all, Whitlam was going to make Ujuru Nunukul the Governor-General. That would have been great, except she wouldn't have it. Never mind. But what I was going to say, no, that's the one thing you must ask, nothing else. Because if you ask more than that, you'll lose. The last referendum, I'll remind you, the people of Australia voted against freedom of religion. They voted against one man, one vote. They have voted against 4-year terms, and they voted against the recognition of local government. How could any electorate do that? Only ours, in monumental apathy. Monumental apathy. So we've got to have one question, and as far as I'm concerned, that is all I want to see asked. Of course I want to see changes to the Constitution, but that's my view, you know, that's a personal view. I'd like to, the reserve powers have got to be addressed one of these days, soon perhaps. The Senate has got to be addressed one of these days. And all of those things have to be addressed. But they are subjects for other questions in other referenda. The most important thing psychologically for Australia is to have an Australian head of state and an Australian independent republic. Because the thing that's wrong with Australia is the colonial cringe. We have a depression. We've had a depression because we adopted other people's methods. Reagan and Thatcher, because if they do it, it must be right. And with people who are brilliant in Australia, brilliant. You know, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in science, whether it's in literature, where did they go? They go somewhere else. Because the local population has been, well, it's subject to this cringe, which is alive and well. Of course, sometimes it goes the other way, and they say, oh, well, nothing's good that's not Australian. But that doesn't make any difference. They're still going away in droves, and they're not backing Australian solutions for Australian problems. You ask even members in Labor Party branches about foreign policy in relation to Southeast Asia, and they say, oh, yeah, well, we want to keep the Yanks around, of course, they're a stabilising influence. I said, well, they've caused more wars than they've solved in the last 25 years. Ah, yes, but, you know, part of multiculturalism, part of the colonial cringe. If you're going to rely on Big Brother, whether it's Elizabeth II and her cohorts, she's getting old, you go to President Clinton and his. And if he's getting old, you go to the Emperor Akihito and his, or go to somebody else. It's a dependency. We're too small. 17 million people, you know, with a GNP, which is the equivalent of the whole of Southeast Asia, and we're too small. But this is, again, part of the cringe and part of the plan of the Statsvolk to keep themselves in power and to keep power, the real power, the money power and the political power in their hands. And that's why a republic would be the crowning of multiculturalism. Because who would be the first president? You say it could easily be a woman. What woman? Who cares? As long as she's got the talent and the ability and the support of the community, that's fine. But as long as we, in Australia, 17 million Australians, have to go to the other side of the world to pick a woman who is there, or a man and Charles will be the man, I suppose, and pick him because he was born into a certain family at a certain time with a certain religion. That's absurd, and it depreciates everybody else. It depreciates all the Australian born, whether they're Anglos or whether they're Assyrians, all of the Australian born. So the Republic will be the crowning of multiculturalism.
I've just got. Do you want to ask a question about that?
No, you continue.
Just to go now, sorry to take you right back 20 years to when you were espousing this new ideology of multiculturalism. How did you see that the best way for it to be implemented was to mainstream the current services or to provide ethnic specific?
No. Mainstreaming was a debate that came later. But I must say that I'm still not convinced that mainstreaming can be suddenly imposed. It doesn't work that way, because you've got a whole generation of people who are not multicultural, who are not multilingual, not even bilingual, and certainly not even bicultural. So it's useless to pretend that that we can suddenly say, oh well, we all now have taken a course in multiculturalism, we can mainstream all services. I don't think that's yet possible. In the future, but not now. And I never intended to do it then. I wanted everybody to be sensitized. Everybody. The clerk on the counter, had to be sensitized to everybody. But to rely on the clerk on the counter with one language and one culture and one background to suddenly embrace everybody. Unreal. I remember in New South Wales, there was a great discussion within the ethnic communities, within the, Ethnic Communities Council, but also the Ethnic Affairs Commission, because I think Paolo Totaro was rather keen to see mainstreaming, I think it was called. Well, that's fine as an objective. I agree with it as an objective. But until you've got a situation where the servants of the people reflect the people, you can't do it.
That was one of the reasons that Gough Whitlam actually gave in the dismantlement of the department in '74, that we should be mainstreaming, and it was. Can you comment on that?
Well, I don't think he meant it in those terms. I don't know. I don't remember him using that term. The department, of course, he dismantled the department because he said, rightly or wrongly, that it was a racist department. Well, of course, it was racist because the government had made it racist. It was organised on racist lines, and he was always very angry about that. And of course, he was angry at what had happened anyway, and he was terribly angry about the fact that some officers, I suppose, had sort of exalted that the new broom had been broken. But I don't think that he had any idea of taking away ethno-specific services, because it was so obvious that was the need of the time. It still is. It still is. Maybe in 20 years' time, of course, it'll be a different thing. But I think that until our public services, and private services for that matter too, it doesn't matter, reflect the population, I think we've got to remain with ethno-specific services. I think so. See, it doesn't matter. The language alone is not the issue. I mean, the Maoris in Sydney, had a terrible time when the Depression struck, because they came across from New Zealand. The New Zealand government didn't support them once they got here. They only had their fare here. Our government didn't give them any benefits for a year or whatever it was. And of course they had all these young people with nothing to do and no jobs, no status, nowhere to go. I mean, it was a recipe for human disaster. Now, it was no use saying, oh, well, they all speak English. What does that mean? See, that was why Addison Road, and I hope that you do a project on Addison Roads, because that's part of the multicultural development of Australia. Well, what they did was to make premises available to a very deprived Maori group, which gave them a meeting place, gave them a sense of solidarity. Then they arranged for some Maori elders to come from New Zealand to help them find themselves, because they were just, you know, they were beginning to be pushed down to be rubbish people of Sydney. And, you know, so you needed an ethno-specific service there. You really did.
So were those ethnic-specific services put in place to address barriers to equal opportunity?
And equal opportunity and equal treatment. For example, let me give you another example, to double say it, but I'm thinking something that you should follow up is the ethnic childcare unit headed by Vivi Kutsunatis, who was also a pioneer ethnic radio. She was a pioneer broadcaster. Ethnic Communities Council, one of the pioneer formation people of that. You know, Vivi Kutsunatis has been one of those great people that made it all possible, helped to make it all possible. Now, with ethnic childcare, that's still tremendously important, and it's still there. And if you go and visit her at Addison Road, where the headquarters are, you'll see the spread of people, including the Cook Islands. You know, there are differences which need to be addressed and need to be understood. Now, the best thing that can happen these days is that in hospitals you get nursing sisters and nurses who are culturally aware, so they know damn well that if they've got a difficulty, they know how to call on someone, because there are various aspects of belief and practice which have to be taken into account. You know, and it's not just a matter of the overseas born, it's a matter of the locally born with the customs of the people that are continued. You know, I mean, my mother, of course, was overseas born, but I must say that for most of her life she believed that entry into a hospital was a prelude to death. You know, so she kept out of it. Of course, she couldn't keep out of it any longer. But you know what I'm saying? That she would have died if it hadn't been for somebody persuading her that it was death or hospital, not hospital and death. I mean, just a typical example that you come across. So these days you can't expect people, I don't think, to professionals to be, you know, to be well up on everybody. It's culture, but they've got to be sensitive. I've got my medico here, David Lee, is a Chinese doctor from Malaya. He's a Malay with Chinese background, whichever you like. So he speaks Malay and he speaks Mandarin and he speaks Cantonese, which is pretty good actually. I had a friend and a colleague whose mother was quite desperately ill and wasn't doing any good because she speaks Cantonese, a particular dialect of Cantonese too, a bit hard. But anyway, she wasn't doing any good, and she was terribly worried. And I said, well, why don't you send him to David Lee? Because the one thing about it is he's culturally sensitive, whether it's an Anglo-Saxon or whether it's Chinese or whether it's whatever it is. So he got through to her what the problem was and got through to her what she should do. You know, it wasn't only a medical problem, it was a communication problem. It still exists.
Can I jump another period?
Yeah, of course. Sorry.
In the development of the Ethnic Communities Council, Bill Jegaro, when we spoke to him, actually said that you did have some concerns about the development and the people involved at the time. Can you recall some of the discussions that you did hold with Bill?
Oh, well, of course, Bill, of course, I had great confidence in him. You know, I had great confidence in Bill Jegaro because I knew, you know, what he was aiming for and what he wanted to do. So I hadn't any doubts about him. But when we were talking about, of course, establishing the council, there was always there was concern at that time, and this was a political concern. There was concern at that time that there was the Captive Nations Council, which was a very right-wing organisation, although all the people in it were not necessarily right-wing, but the leadership had fled the Soviet Union, and therefore communism, socialism, and the Labour Party were anathema. And they only had one agenda, really, which was a great pity in some ways. But they only had one agenda, and that was, of course, to restore the captive nations to freedom. Inverted commas. So they existed. Now, I think that probably Bill might have been talking about what was, because he was Russian, of course, in background. Actually born in Russia. But I think he was concerned about what would be, you know, the balance with that. But my view was that, of course, I had concerns about the captive nations because it was really a negative thing rather than a positive thing. But my view was that within that organisation, among the components were some very outstanding groups. Now, the most outstanding group that I encountered was the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were very strong in retaining language. They had a very highly sophisticated system throughout Australia of language schools. They even had inspectors who appointed to go to the various language schools to make sure that the teachers were up to standard and the teaching was up to standard. Now that was, you know, that was a degree of sophistication which was quite outstanding. They, of course, they had across the board. They had cultural activities. They'd also outstandingly linked up with tertiary institutions, Ukrainian tertiary institutions, in Canada and Europe, outside of Ukraine itself, of course. And of course they had the church, the Ukrainian, well, the one that I knew, of course, I know they have Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholic. Well, the Ukrainian Catholic Church was the one that I knew, mainly, of course, because the people that I was associated with in the community happened to be Ukrainian Catholics, which had been suppressed, and I don't think the Vatican had done very much about it either, frankly. So they felt pretty lost. But they built their own churches, built their own, you know, background, and it was not. I found them probably an outstanding component of the Australian community. I really did. I admired them very much.
Can you recall?
Yes, I've got them. I've got them. It'll just. Matter of fact, I went to a function one night, again at Ashfield, where they had a guest who was the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army in 1922, when they were defeated by the Soviet army. And of course, their short-lived republic didn't live very long. But it was very interesting, you know, that they had that what would I call it, continuity. And also I found that the Canadians, the Ukrainian Canadians, had a big influence on them because they had set up their educational institutions, and the Ukrainian university actually is located in Munich. And it's a very big university. In fact, I was given an honorary doctorate there, which, you know, various things I suppose. But the most important thing really was that, see, within that captive nations council there was bodies like the Ukrainians. And Bill, I think, who had really proper concerns, I think was convinced in the end that, you know, they were not a threat to the development of a democratic ethnic communities council. So it didn't arise. But I think that was something that was discussed at the time. But the two things were too separate. You know, they were totally focused as a captive nations council on things outside, totally focused. And whereas the council, of course, dealt with the people here.
That's about it, I think.
Thank you very, very much.
Pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Enjoyed it. I hope.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank
But
you.
I hope that. But I really wish you well. Can I just place on record? I think what you're doing will be a great national work, because there are so many aspects of this. We just mentioned Addison Road, ethnic childcare, all part of the march towards multiculturalism. And communities like the Ukrainians, who deserve, I think, very, very great, well, very adequate recognition, or adequate recognition, let me say, for the contribution they made in culture, welfare, within the community, and language. I think they did extremely well, and did it in a positive way. You know, it wasn't a meeting to say, well, now we must get together and attack Joe. It was a positive group, and I admire them very much. There's so many aspects that I think that you'll enjoy. I think I envy you for doing the project. Good luck.
Thank you very much.